Okay, so before we turn to our more detailed discussions of the questions about race in the first half of the course, which are, as I said, in what we call social ontology, which is about the nature of social objects, and race is a kind of social object, I wanted to make vivid for you some of the facts about human ancestry and human variation that are part of the background to racial thinking. So I'm going to do that in a moment by introducing you to a little boy named Eric. But I want to tell you a couple of things about Eric before you meet him. First, I want you to know that everybody in England, almost everybody in England, more than 95% of the people in England who have any ancestors who were in England 100 years ago, all of them have an ancestry that goes back to King Edward III. Now, of course, any contemporary person who is descended from Edward III, say, for example, King Charles, is going to be descended from a lot of other people as well, including many people who were peasants at the time of the life of Edward III. So everybody in England is descended from aristocrats and from peasants, and almost everybody in England is descended from Edward III. And those of you who know any European history will know that if you're descended from Edward III, you're also descended from Charlemagne, who is one of Edward III's ancestors. So almost everybody in England is descended from Charlemagne too. Now, of course, those peasant ancestors are probably going to seem to people less interesting than Edward III. It's more exciting to be told that you're descended from Edward III of England than it is to be told that you're descended from somebody you've never heard of, whose name we don't know. So, of course, if we did find the name of somebody who lived in England at the time of Edward III, it'd be very hard to tell where his or her ancestors were today, because people don't keep the records of the births and deaths of poor people in the Middle Ages. Extremely hard to trace back the ancestry of, or to find the descent of poorer people. It's easier in England than it is in most of continental Europe, because births and deaths, including the births and deaths of poor people in England, were recorded in local churches. And local church records from 1,000 years ago have survived in most of England, which they haven't in most of Europe, because there were wars in Europe in which churches were burnt down and the church records were destroyed. But that didn't happen so much in England. But still, it's very hard to trace the ancestry of people who are not descended from people whose records were kept. But look, since many are people who were in England, that's a picture of Edward III, handsome-looking gentleman. Since many people who were in England a century ago have descendants in Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, Edward III, of course, has lots and lots of descendants outside England. He has descendants all over the place. He has some in Sao Paulo, some in New York, some in Canberra, Sydney, probably some in Shanghai, for all we know. And certainly, I would say, some in Hong Kong, which is full of people who have ancestry in England. So, all right, here's a picture that, given that background fact, here's a picture of four people, and three of those people are descended from Edward III. So which of the people in this picture is not probably descended from Edward III? No guesses? Or just unwilling to speak out? Yes, I would assume the one on the left. The one on the left, good. And that's correct. So we get back to all this in a minute, but now all that said, let me introduce you to Eric. Here's Eric. If you can see this picture, if you can look at this picture carefully, you'll see that he's reading a book called, well, looking at the book, at this age he couldn't read, called The Lies That Bind by somebody called Kwame Anthony Appiah. So you may guess that I have some relationship to Eric. But here's Eric with his dad. And I can confirm that both these people are descendants of Edward III. That is Eric with his mum. How likely do you think it is that his mum is a descendant of Edward III? You're allowed to speak. No. Not very likely, indeed. Doesn't it seem very likely? She's from Namibia. So now I don't suppose you find any of this very surprising so far, maybe except that this amazing fact that almost everybody in England is descended from one of the English kings, and many people are descended from later queens and kings. All right, but here's a slightly more surprising fact. Which of these people is not descended from Edward III? Harder to guess, but guess anyway. Good, you've made some inferences. So the male on the left is not descended from Edward III. He's that's because he's Norwegian. Now, as you may have figured out, the reason I know Eric is that I'm related to him. This is Eric. This is his grandmother. I'm her brother, so he's my great nephew. And as you can figure out, therefore, again, by making the same pattern of inferences, I am a descendant of Edward III, as well as a lot of 14th century English peasants. Now, and here I am with Eric when he was very little, having a snooze. Now, the first picture I showed you, was from left to right. In this picture, that's me, about the same age as Eric. That's my father, that's my mother, and that's my mother's mother, grandmother. And my English grandmother is Eric's great-great-grandmother, which is why, and as I said, like most people in England, my grandmother and her husband were descended from Edward III, which is why all the people in these pictures who are descended from Edward III are descended from Edward III. They're descended through my grandmother and her husband, my grandfather. Now, I hope I hope these pictures will help you to keep in mind as we move ahead that you should be cautious in making assumptions about the connections between appearance and ancestry. And that's one of the facts that underlies some of the difficulties in the way in which people ordinarily think about race. So, for example, keep in mind, well, so now I want to ask you how to classify the people in some of these pictures. Let's see, have I got a screen? Yeah. So you can ask me any questions you want to about the ancestry of any of the people in these pictures, but how should they be classified in the racial vocabulary of the United States? Black, terrific. My father, born in West Africa, in Ghana, to a father and a mother from the same town, and descended from people mostly who have lived in that town for several centuries. What about this person, this descendant from Edward of descendants of my English family? How would you classify her racially? White. And her husband was the same sort of rough ancestry as she was, so I assume he's white too. I didn't bring you a picture of him. And therefore their daughter is, presumably. So my mother, white. What am I? Biracial, mixed, something like that. So not black, apparently. Black and biracial. Am I white, black, and biracial, or just black and biracial?
You're both black and white, which makes Spanish.
I'm both black and white, which makes me biracial. What about this guy? This is Eric Stad.
He's one.
He's white. Okay. But remember, that's Christian, his name is Christian. That's Christian's mom. Still want to say he's white? In our system? Maybe we should do a poll. How many think that this person, and remember, that person you just said was white, this is his grandfather. This is his maternal grandfather. So how many of you want to say that who still want to say that he's white, having seen his grandfather? How many of you want to say that he's mixed race? Sorry, put the white hands up again. I just want to see how many hands stay up. So mixed race as well as white. A bit of a shifting around. Nobody thinks he's black, given the way you've answered all these other questions. All right, good. Now, remember that, however, despite what you all just said, if Christian had lived in the United States 100 years ago, he would have been black under the law. Because under the law, if you had, well, there weren't 50 states 100 years ago, but in all the states there were 100 years ago, it was a matter of state law what your race was. And so the answer is different in different places. But in most places, he would have been classified as black. The mixed race doesn't occur as a category in the census until much later. When Christian was a teenager, he came to visit me and my husband in Massachusetts, where we then lived. And we took him to dinner with my best friend, who's African-American from West Virginia, for that matters, and married to a white American, also from West Virginia. And their two daughters, who are my godchildren, and my husband's too. And at one point in the dinner, my goddaughters set about trying to persuade Christian, who at that point had lived in Norway, Botswana, Angola, Namibia, and Ghana most of his life, tried to persuade him he was black. Now, as you can imagine, we adults kept out of the conversation. This was fascinating to watch with a group of young people trying to figure our weird racial system. All right, so now I want to turn to mapping some of the things that the word race does in contemporary United States, before turning at the end today to some of the issues in the reading, which we'll continue to explore next time as well. So the most obvious thing about the modern word race, when it's used of people, is that it picks out a set of human kinds of human being. We can give them, those kinds, a variety of names. So in the United States, you can say, as somebody did, someone was black, or that they're African-American, or you could say that they were African. I mean, that's a racial category too, even though you wouldn't use it with an American, probably. Negro used to be one of the words that was used in this country. It was a scientific word for black people. A lot of people use the word colored until relatively recently. In fact, my best friend, who daughters tried to persuade my nephew that he was black, wrote a book called Colored People about growing up in West Virginia as a black person. difference. And then we can say fancier things like person of color or of African ancestry, things like that. Then we have white, of course, as a category, European American, European, Caucasian, of European ancestry. I'm only going to give you polite ones. There are rude words for all these things. Then Asian American Asian of Asian ancestry, sometimes we used to say yellow people. And then Native Americans, people sometimes in the past called them red, as in Red Indians was the name that was used. Indian, a name they were called because the wandering Europeans who got here mistakenly were trying to find India. They knew there was one way around to India. They were interested there was another way around to India. And when they hit America, they thought they hit India, so they called them Indians. But many Native Americans today would rather be called Indian than Native American, and so there are a perfectly respectable term. A lot of people who are Native American use the term Indian to refer to themselves, though they use lots of other terms as well. And of course, typically they will have an identity as a tribal person, Sioux, Cheyenne, those people. And then sometimes we say indigenous in the Americas to refer to anybody whose ancestors were here, roughly speaking, before 1492. Okay, and those are all racial categories. I think it's plausible to say that we use them. So what does that mean? One thing, well, so these things have vaguely there are sort of vaguely scientific sounding terms because these categories got to be used in science at a certain point. Mongolian is a rather misleading term that was sometimes used for all East Asians for no very good reason. But one thing you can notice about this list is that in there are things that refer to categories to people outside the United States, right? So the first thing you want to say about, I think, about American racial categories is that they're not meant to apply just to Americans. We're supposed to be able to apply them to some people outside the United States. Maybe not to everybody. Maybe there are people we don't know how to fit into this system. Maybe we know there are people we don't know how to fit into this system, but we expect to be able to fit a lot of people into this system who don't live in the United States. If you're a normal Han Chinese person, you're going to be Asian in this racial system. And even though you didn't ask to be categorized in this way, and it's probably not how you think about things, you probably don't think of Asians as an interesting category if you're Han Chinese. I mean, living in China, you won't think it's an interesting category because what will strike you about the populations of East Asia is that they come in different categories. That some of them are Japanese and some of them are Korean. Some of them are Vietnamese, some are Mongolian and so on. But still, these categories are meant to be applicable not just locally, but globally. So Black people, and I mean, in this context, just phenomenologically Black people, people with dark skins, who come here from Haiti or from Brazil or Ghana, will tend to be fittable into this system, if they look that way, as African Americans, when people are thinking about things racially, at least if they spend a bit of time here. Maybe they don't step off the boat as African Americans, but if they have children, say, two Brazilian couple, dark-skinned people come here, have a child in America, that child may, or the family may choose to try and resist the designation African American because they may think they're Brazilian or something, which of course they're also. But as it were, on the street they'll be Black, they'll be African Americans, and that's because these categories are supposed to be working globally. Another thing to say, which is evident on this list, is that the favored names for these groups have differed over time. that's one of the reasons why keeping track of races in the US Census is difficult, because the government keeps changing the names of these groups. And occasionally it invents new ones. So in the 1960s, the government invented the category of the Hispanic, and the census invented the category of the Hispanic. And before that, those people were many things, but they were not Hispanic for the purposes of the census. They could have been black, they could have been white, they could have been mixed, but they weren't going to be Hispanic. So the favored terms have changed, names have changed, and now I think the word Negro is offensive to some people and certainly sounds old-fashioned probably to most people, but it was the normal, respectable word for black people in the 1960s, say, when W.E. Du Bois, well, I mean, from the 1930s to the 1960s, so W.E. Du Bois wrote a book called The Negro, and wanted to create an encyclopedia of the Negro, and those were the proper scientific terms for black people in his day. And as I say, and there are new categories, right? So a category is racial, not just if it picks out a single race, but if it picks people out by their race. So BIPOC is an expression you may have heard. Have you heard that expression, BIPOC? Do you know what its etymology is? Good. Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Now, so now that just means, of course, basically what that means is not white, right? Or maybe not white or Asian, I'm not sure. Depends on whether you think of people, Asians are people of color, and people have various views about that, including people who are who identify as Asian American. So, so the categories change and the vocabulary changes, but still, there's some continuity over the history of the United States in some of these categories. The Africans became colored or Negro, and colored or Negro people became African Americans at a certain point. Those became the predominant ways of referring to people, and now I think there's an oscillation between African American and Black. Now, kinds of person come in many flavors. There are lots of kinds of person. For example, philosopher, that's a kind of person. Lawyer, novelist, chemist, engineer, these are kinds of person too. And then those are things, of course, that you become by doing something, by training or study, or by taking qualifying exams and so on. Races, on the other hand, are not normally thought of things that you have to do anything yourself to acquire. You don't have to pass the Black exam to get to be a properly certified Black person. You just get to be a Black person on the basis of whatever it is that people use to decide that people are Black, and so on for white people and so on. And one sort of feature of that is that these racial groups are what I'm going to call ancestral groups. And a group is ancestral, this is just a definition, if your parents are both members of the group, you're a member of the group too. Right? Now, this doesn't say anything about what we should say about people who have parents from two groups. But if your parents are both members of this group, then you're members. And if it follows from that you're a member of the group, then it's an ancestral group. This is just a definition. And I hope this is a useful idea, however, not just making up definitions for the heck of it, because I think that's one of the features of racial thinking, is that if we're not sure what race somebody is, because of how they look, say, and we inquire as to their parentage, and we discover that both their parents were of a certain race, we're likely to say, okay, I wasn't sure before, but now I'm sure that they're whatever they are. If their parents are of different categories, racial categories, then we may still be puzzled. All right, now, as I'm just insisting that on this definition, it's sufficient for being of a certain race to have two parents of that race, but it may not be necessary. There may be other ways of getting to be a member of a race than having two parents who are members of it. That's not, this leaves that open. If there were groups, well, if there are groups which are what I would call strictly ancestral, where it's necessary and sufficient for being a member of the group that you have two parents of that group, right? So black in America is not a strictly ancestral group because you just indicated that you can be black and mixed race. At least most of you think that that's possible. And so it's not necessary to be, to have two black parents to be black in America. But it is sufficient. All right. Now, to fix the races, of course, you'll need not only this rule, and some other rule about how to deal with people when there's mixture. You'll also need to know how to identify the people, the origins, the first people of the race, right? Because otherwise, in order to answer the question whether you're an X, we're going to have to answer the question what parents are, and in order to answer that, we're going to have to answer whether their parents were, and at some point we're going to have some other answer. That's going to be part of an account of any particular kind of ancestral group. You're going to have some source, some idea about how it all began, as it were. Now, the rule that I suggested allows that ancestral groups can occur, therefore, where the membership of some people is uncertain. So that's because this rule says nothing, as I said, about what you do with people like me and my sister and Christian and Eric, whose parents are not of the same racial groups. Now, one way in which somebody could have a parent who wasn't of some racial group is that they could have a parent who was of no racial group, right? So if there are people who can't be classified racially, we'll perhaps be particularly puzzled what to say about people who have children with those people. And there probably are people that most people would find it hard to put into our system. And I'll talk about that in a while, not today, but later. I believe we're supposed to exit the building when that happens, but let's hold on for like 2 minutes, 1 minute. Okay.